Good. So we're here today to talk about plastics. I talked about climate change last time, which obviously with Climate Council and such, that's a big deal. Talking about plastics, which is also becoming an ever increasing issue for us as individuals and as society, and surprisingly very connected. I mean, the connection between climate and plastics is pretty significant. So we'll talk about that. Chad basically, shared who I am, what I do, president of the Climate Council. We just finished up our 2025 Earth Festival there in Kansas City, which went really well. Encourage all of you to get engaged with that group. Partnership, there's a climate directory listing on the website, which advertises what you're doing. There's a weekly newsletter that goes out with all the partner events and news. About 50 partners in the group now. So it's a great way to communicate. First Tuesday of every month, we have a partner meeting, which is just, all the partners who have something happening that month getting together on Zoom and sharing information, sharing resources. So it's a really great group. Also produce the Climate Hour podcast, which is doing really good worldwide, syndicated nationally on Pacifica Radio Network, but streaming and getting surprisingly good ratings worldwide. So if you listen to podcasts, and that can be on iTunes, Android, Spotify, Pandora, any streaming app you have on your phone, you should be able to find the Climate Hour. So please look for that. Speaker, here we are, I'm speaking, and an author. So we looked at the Field Guide to Climate Change a couple months ago, I think it was 2-3 months ago, and we're going to look at the Field Guide to Plastic now. As I said, the plastics and climate are very closely related. And both of my books are basically workbooks. They're how-tos. They're how to address the issues. First, they explain the issues, and then every chapter kind of closes with this list of talking points and a list of action items. So they're very much driven towards what we as individuals can do to address these issues. The goal of Unpacking the Plastics Pandemic is to help us understand the types of plastics and their chemical additives so that we can lower plastics risk to our individual health and to the environment. And surprisingly, it also saves money by investing in low impact alternatives. I always like to look at climate solutions in any of the issues that we're addressing. We need to look at them economically too, because if it's not feasible or cost effective to do something, most of us won't. So I always like to look at the cost benefits of doing something and present it in that context. I mean, if we can save money doing something and it makes us healthier and it's great for the planet, then why won't everybody do that? Here's a table of contents. We're basically going to follow that roughly today. The introduction, and this is true of all of my field guides, the hard science and the politics, I mean, all these things are a little political these days. I put those in the introduction, and I tell people if you're not interested in hard science, if you're not wanting to talk about the politics, you just want to get to issues and solutions, just skip the introduction. And I think that's very valid. It doesn't matter what the politics are behind something. If it affects all of us, we all should just work together to do something about it and set the politics aside. At the same time, I do like to put a little history in there. And like I say, some hard science for those that want to know. So that's in the introduction. And I think we'll start with just a short video covering the introduction to plastics and then rapidly move beyond that. So the introduction, plastics, politics, and fossil fuels. Here's a video.
Almost the only hope left for the oil industry for growth is from plastics.
The industry expects plastic to drive half of its future growth. And the big oil is getting down and dirty to make these predictions true. A New York Times investigation revealed that the industry is lobbying to weaken regulations on plastic in Kenya and use it as a hub for supplying US-made chemicals and plastics to other markets in Africa. And when they can't change regulations, big corporations have a few tricks up their sleeves.
They distract, they delay, and then they derail.
Emma Priestland is a plastic pollution campaigner who seeks to hold companies accountable for their plastic production.
For example, lots of big companies, they come out with these big fancy sounding commitments to tackle plastic pollution. Companies will come forward and say, look, we're already dealing with the problem ourselves. You don't need to make policy. But in reality, very little changes.
But there are also more obvious tactics.
They also lobby the actual policy processes. They try to change the meanings of words, they water things down, they throw enormous amounts of money at lobbying policymakers themselves. And then ultimately, once a policy has been made, the companies do everything they can to try to change the implementation of that.
These strategies help companies avoid economic sanctions and keep the price for virgin plastic so low that possible alternatives struggle to compete. There have been some amazing innovations in recent years. We can produce bioplastic with plants rather than oil. And we are finding new ways of recycling it instead of extracting new fossil fuels. But their success is limited by their price. Making virgin plastic from oil is still cheaper. And now the oil industry is investing in new factories that will lower the price of virgin plastic even further.
That's the politics, that's the thing. And that's the connection to climate. We've worked really hard in the climate movement to find alternatives to fossil fuels. We now have renewable energy, electric cars, a lot of great solutions that are working and that are going to happen, regardless of politics. They're just so cost effective now that they are going to happen. So what happens to the fossil fuels? I mean, our plan was we get the renewables and the fossil fuel extraction and burning goes away. Yay for the climate. But what's actually happening is the fossil fuel industry, the petroleum industry, is just redirecting all of their extraction into new plastics. You can see the International Energy Agency here predicting that plastics is going to consume 45% of all fossil fuels by 2040. British Petroleum, the CEO of British Petroleum goes further. He's on record saying that 95% of all British Petroleum's extractions will be going into plastics in the next 15 years. There's 333 new plastic petrochemical facilities being built in the US since 2010. ExxonMobil's got about $20 billion going into new plastics capability along the US Gulf Coast. A lot of those old refineries and such being converted to plastic and petrochemical production. Shell just built a $6 billion ethane cracking plant 25 miles from Pittsburgh. I was engaged with the protesters that were fighting against that a few years ago, and obviously we lost. It's up, it's running. There's been over 400 billion in oil assets moved into new plastics capacity worldwide. So we haven't eliminated the fossil fuels, we've just redirected them to plastics. There's a nice little chart from Yale School of the Environment showing what annual emissions from plastic production is going to look like over the upcoming years. So, we haven't fixed this problem, we've just redirected it. So there's the politics. Let's put those out of the way. Let's talk about plastics. Some people are actually surprised to say that plastics are fossil fuels. They're the process just doesn't make sense from a pretty plastic point of view to that raw gushy stuff that comes up out of the ground. So here's a short video talking about the making of
On the molecular
plastics.
level, plastics are made of polymers, which are long, flexible chains of chemical compounds. This structure allows plastics to be easily molded and shaped, especially under heat and pressure. Unlike the rubber used by the Olmecs, most of today's plastics are man-made and derived from fossil fuels. Crude oil and natural gas are primary sources as they provide a cheap alternative to plastic made from plants. The first step in the production of plastic is the extraction of crude oil and natural gas from the ground. From there, the fossil fuels are sent to refineries where they are converted into several products, including the building blocks of plastic, ethane from crude oil and propane from natural gas. Ethane and propane are then sent to a cracker plant to be cracked or broken down into smaller molecules. Ethane produces ethylene and propane becomes propylene. Next, a catalyst is mixed in, which links the molecules together and forms polymers called resins. This structure allows plastics to be easily molded and shaped, especially under heat and pressure. Polymerization converts ethylene into the resin polyethylene and propylene into polypropylene. These resins are then melted, cooled down, and chopped up into pre-production plastic pellets known as nurdles. Nurdles are later transported to manufacturers who use heat to mold the nurdles into different types of plastic products. Many of those products actually feature information about their manufacturing process. Numbers called resin identification codes are often featured, indicating which chemicals were used to make the plastic.
There's your hard science making it. Crude oil, you extract the ethane, break that down into the monomers ethylene, chain that into polyethylene. Natural gas, and this is basically what you're burning in your furnace. If you still have a gas furnace in your home, you can extract the propylene monomer from that, chain them together into the polypropylenes. And surprisingly, even coal, countries that don't have a lot of natural gas or crude oil, they're actually liquefying coal and extracting ethylene and propylene from that to make their plastics. China's a big company or a big country doing that because they don't have a lot of natural gas, a lot of crude oil resources, but they do have a lot of coal. And as you can imagine, coal being the dirty resource it is in terms of carbon emissions, this process of cracking the coal is extremely dirty. Anyway, we can get plastics from all of these crude products. The catalysts are added to the polypropylene, polyethylene, and those with the chemical additives is what control the resin's qualities. So we've got the resins, and then we have all the chemicals that control their qualities. And as they said, the resins are chopped up into nurdles, which are shipped around the world to the factories. Here's what nurdles look like. You know, these small 1/8 to 1/4 inch little beads of plastic. You're seeing a lot of different colors there. So these are representing different types of plastic that are going to have different qualities. It's basically the chemical additives that are giving them their color and their texture. Plastics, as we know them, they're 93% resin and 7% chemical additives. The chemical additives control color transparency, flexibility, stability, flame retardants, water resistance, lubricants, fillers, tackifiers. There's lots and lots of chemicals going into plastics. The resins are non-biodegradable. We talk about why plastic is going to be in our environment forever. We will look at that. The resins never break down, but the chemicals leach out of the plastic over time. All of the health issues associated with plastics are from the chemicals that are leaching out of the plastics, leaving the resins, which stay in our environment much forever. There are 10,000 known chemicals in plastics, and these are independent labs analyzing the plastics and comparing them to the chemical registry, looking at their chemical registry number. And they've also found 3,000 unknown chemicals in plastics. You know, plastic companies are competing with other companies, so they have their trade secrets. They're creating chemicals and then locking them up as trade secrets. So there's been no studies as to their toxicity, their longevity, and such as that. So over 13,000 known, unknown chemicals in the plastics we consume every day. Let's look at coding it. And, you know, the film talked about the resin codes, and we're all used to this. We think of these as recycle codes. The resin codes came first. That was just a solid triangle with the number. And then the recycle codes actually came out of that recycling, you know, when the chemical companies decided to give us recycling so we wouldn't be so afraid of plastics. And that's where the arrows come in. The interesting story about this is about a decade ago, 8, 9, 10 years ago, the lawyers of the chemical companies told them to stop using the recycle triangle and start using the solid one, because the recycle triangle on the bottom of your plastic container had legal implications that it could be recycled. And because so many of these things can't, the plastics company were getting sued. So these days you turn it over, you're more likely to see the solid resin code than any sort of indication that this might be a recyclable product. We'll look at this chart more later, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that page. So let's talk about the chemical additives. As I say, the resins themselves are going to be there forever. And there's issues with the resins that we'll talk about, health issues, environmental issues. But really the thing that is affecting us most right now is the chemicals that leach out of your plastics.
Plastics are being used to such an extent throughout the world that we may well ask what was used before its discovery.
Before 1950, plastic was barely a part of American life. So how did our culture become so plastic? Modern plastic didn't really get its start until World War II, when the military realized how versatile it could be.
If you're old enough to remember the old-fashioned glass windscreens, this is what happened when you banged your nut.
Yeah, huge improvement there. But after the war ended, plastic companies needed to find new ways to sell their products.
Both sheets and powder are now being dramatically applied to peacetime living in hundreds of beautiful and useful ways.
And so, plastic went from protecting cargo to protecting our leftovers.
Food stored in baggies plastic bags always have the sound of freshness.
And nylon went from the skies to our thighs.
They stretch better to fit better.
And of course, who could forget?
My mama done told me, she told me, hun, we're having a party, a Tupperware party.
People went absolutely crazy for plastic.
In a new plastic decorator container.
Put them in a polyethylene plastic bag.
And to brighten up the plastic tree, plastic decorations.
Nowadays, everything can be made in plastic.
This was where our addiction began. For decades, Americans had a make it do or do without mentality. But our new throwaway culture fell in love with single-use plastics and didn't worry about the consequences.
Being disposable, there are no empties to collect.
Vinyl and asbestos on the floor.
In fresh sun, sea, and sky colors.
Oh, the irony.
That was a Nat Geo video. Here's another video, and I have the sound turned off in that so I can talk over this. The point of that, excuse me, is that plastics are pretty ubiquitous. They're everywhere. We don't really realize how much we're surrounded by them. In our homes, the odds are that your carpeting's plastic, the latex paint on your wall is plastic, your draperies are going to be plastic, your clothes, your kitchen, the products you bring in, obviously, are electronics. Plastic is pretty much everywhere. We're looking at an alternative here. I mean, here's a scientist looking at aluminum cans, and he's actually dissolving those cans and shows some stuff here. But you know, there are alternatives out there, but we don't realize just how ubiquitous the plastics are until we start looking at them. One of the things I do in the book is we've developed a little game called I See Plastics. And it's a way for people to get together and kind of challenge each other to look around the space they're in, any space they're in, whether it's a home or work or elsewhere, and actually see the plastics that are there and identify them in terms of their resin code so that you understand that plastic's potential bad effects on your health and your environment. And here we are coming back to this can, he's dissolved the aluminum. And the reason I include this video is that you're discovering that even aluminum cans are lined with plastic. All of our food cans have a plastic liner in them. So the plastic is ubiquitous. It is in many places we don't expect it. It is very hard to get away from, but there are ways to address that. In the environment, I mean, we're talking about plastics being in our home. We also breathe plastics. This is
as much as 74 tons of microplastics fell from the air and settled on rooftops, gardens and other surfaces in Auckland, New Zealand in 2020. This baffling observation is made by a study published on December 12, 2022 in the Environmental Science and Technology Journal. To give it context, 74 tons of microplastic is equivalent to 3 million plastic bottles. Microplastics are formed during the making of plastic products and the breaking down of large plastics due to weathering and aging. According to the study, we may inhale substantial quantities of microplastics with every breath, and these plastics will eventually flow into our blood and accumulate in our organs. Scientists have been discussing the possibility that microplastic mists and clouds exist in the atmosphere, but this is the first study to quantify the magnitude of the problem. The researchers from the University of Auckland used a colored dye that emits light under certain conditions to identify the microplastics because they are invisible to the naked eye. On average, 4,885 airborne plastic particles had accumulated in 1 square meter in one day.
So we're breathing it. It's in the things we buy, we breathe it. talking about breathing studies. And the book has a lot of studies it references, basically footnotes at the end of the book. So you can find out exactly who did the study and what the details are if you're interested. But the bullet points are 2021, 65% of lungs studied in autopsies. So these are from dead people. 65% of the lungs had microplastics in them. 2 years later, a 2023 study looked at living tissues. These are tissues collected during lung surgeries and other things, found microplastics in 85% of all the samples. They found plastics in the blood for the first time in 23, and that was in 77% of blood samples. It didn't just magically appear in our blood samples that year, just nobody had thought to look for plastics in blood. So in 2023, the university said, hey, let's see what's going on there. It's like 77% of the samples found microplastics. Let's talk about drinking it.
Examination have found microplastics in 83% of tap water samples from major cities around the world and in 93% of samples from the world's top 11 bottled water brands.
So we're buying it, putting it in our homes, we're breathing it, we're drinking it. 2018 study, all different brands of water purchased across 9 countries found microplastics in 93% of them. 2020 study found that babies drinking milk from plastic feeding bottles were ingesting 3 million microplastics a day. That's a shocking number. The 2021 study found microplastics in 75% of human breast milk samples. So even if you're not using the bottle, we're still seeing microplastics affect our children. And of course, we eat it.
In a study done in South Korea, scientists sampled 39 brands of table salt from around the world and found microplastics in 36 of them.
36 out of 39. And that's not so much saying that they're there, that's saying that they're in our food. They're not just in our packaging, passing to our food. At this point in our industrial cycle, the industrial process itself is introducing plastics to our food. This is how much plastic, and this slide's actually about 5 years old. It's probably gotten bigger. But at the time, weekly, this is how much plastic you'd be eating. It's how much you'd eat in a month. Just visualize this. How much plastic each of us are eating every 6 months, every year. And over a decade, we'd actually be ingesting a cruise ship life preserver. So it's a lot of plastic entering our systems. And of course, we wear it. There's a little video talking about fast fashion.
Most clothing is now made of a material called polyester, which is a petroleum-based fiber that requires large amounts of fossil fuels for manufacturing. According to Forbes, that number has now reached up to 70 million barrels a year. And the rise of fast fashion went hand in hand with a rise in polyester production. Now polyester manufacturing for clothing far outpaces other common materials like cotton or wool.
So wearing it, our clothing, and not just our clothing, also wearing it in our bodies. And I'm talking about the soaps, the lotions, the makeup, all of those things not only are coming in plastic containers, so there are obviously some microplastic, but a lot of those contain plastics that are deliberately added to provide texture and such to the product. Some of you may remember back in 2017, they banned microbeads. A lot of cosmetics and soap products, skin cleaners and such were coming with microbeads deliberately in the product, and those provided an abrasive and exfoliating quality. They were so ubiquitously bad. They were shutting down municipal sewage systems. They were so bad that we actually banned them. The government took the step of banning those, which we rarely do in this country. But the companies just found alternatives. In many of those cases, they just started using propylene glycol, which is the precursor to plastic. In other cases, I've read studies where they're finding glitter that's been chopped up into small microplastic sized particles and added. So we banned microbeads, different types of plastics that wouldn't be legally called a microbead are still being introduced into our plastics. And of course, our eyeglasses and our contact lenses. We talk about wearing plastics. We're also wearing those glasses, and we have contact lenses made out of plastic in our eyes. Which leads us to trashing it. We've seen this ubiquitous flow of plastics into our life. Where does it go from there? This is trashing.
In 2015, we sent 10 million tons of textiles to landfills in the US. That's the equivalent in weight to approximately 5 million cars. All of it in our landfills. And this is where you think, well, I don't throw my clothes in the garbage. I give it to people who need it, or I recycle it. The problem is the clothes you bring here or here doesn't always end up where you think it does.
This is a graveyard of unwanted clothes.
This warehouse in Miami takes in 120,000 pounds of clothes a week. So let's do that car comparison again. That's the weight of 30 cars getting delivered here every week.
People buy and they give it away, the clothing. They use it maybe 1, 2, 3 times, and they buy new clothing. You know, this is a big difference. This country is a big difference with other countries.
Don Juan buys the clothes that Goodwill and Salvation Army receive from donations but can't sell in their stores. He then sells it to countries in Latin America.
So Don Juan's happy about that, but the countries in Latin America, not so much. This is where most of that clothing ends up. And again, I've muted the sound on that because I wanted to talk over this. We actually brought a young designer, Francisca, from this landfill. She lived near this. And because of growing up around this trash, she developed a career of making new clothing out of remnants of old clothing. So I had a chance to talk to her about the impacts of all these plastics, you know, in her yard, basically in her backyard. Anyway, we brought her here to Kansas City for a 3-month fellowship at the sewing lab. Some of you may have seen her when she was here in 23. So she was talking about this landfill and how they'd play there as kids. Obviously, all the toxins coming out of these plastics have huge health impacts. All the toxins leaching from these plastics are getting into the water systems. Here we're seeing the harbor where those containers are shipped in from America. I think this is going to tell us how many tons. Yeah, look at that, 59,000 tons of used secondhand American clothing being shipped there. Don Juan's making some money off of that, but you know, the Chileans are suffering from it. These things not only, you can see the mountains here, these are not only toxic in terms of the chemicals leaching out, but Francisco was telling me about the fires that these things could spontaneously combust. These are fossil fuel based petrol textiles. So these things do burn. And when they were playing these, there was always that awareness that a fire could be starting near you and you had to get out of it. Think of burning tires. Think of the toxic chemical clouds that are coming off of that. If a mountain like that catches on fire, it actually impacted people for hundreds of miles around there. This is another video. This is from El Salvador. So we see our fast fashions being exported to Chile. We see plastics, our plastic water bottles, detergent bottles being bundled up. Up until 2017, we were selling them to China, and even China said, no more, we won't take your trash. So at that point, we start exporting it to Kenya and El Salvador. And it's the same thing. This stuff piles up in these giant landfills of plastic. The chemicals leach into the water. The rain washes the plastics into the rivers. So we're seeing this flow of plastics into these third world environments, into the global south, where it's affecting people's ability to feed themselves, you know, affecting people's ability to income in the case of the fishermen here, affecting tourism, if you will. Can you imagine a pristine area like that? So washing this trash from America out of the landfills into the rivers, and then down the rivers and into the oceans.
Between Hawaii and California, in an area about twice the size of Texas, is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. For decades, tons of our plastic debris has accumulated there because of swirling ocean currents. It looks like a cloudy soup, and that's because the plastic objects are spaced far apart, and they range in size from large debris to microscopic. There are at least 4 other garbage patches like this in the world. And after scientists discovered them, starting in the 90s, they thought that this might be where a lot of the plastic ended up, out there, floating on the surface. But recently, scientists brought large nets to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and took a closer look at the objects they pulled out. They found water bottles, and hard hats, and bottle caps, and toothbrushes, and toilet seats, and laundry baskets. And using what they found, they were able to calculate how much debris was in all of the garbage patches.
There were about a few 100,000 tons of plastics at the surface of the ocean, which is a huge number.
It is a big number, but a few 100,000 metric tons of plastic is only about 1% of the estimated 8 million tons of plastic scientists believe is emitted into the ocean every year.
This is, Chad mentioned I'm in Hawaii, and this is what actually brought me to Hawaii. I came out here to study the Great Pacific Garbage Patch for my book on plastics. So it was an opportunity to come to the islands and see this for myself and look at the content. I believe this is another silent video. I interviewed Kevin several times over the last couple of years. He's with NOAA, but he runs the Papahanaumokuakea Marine Debris Project, which is looking at all those islands north of Hawaii. I'm on that big island at the bottom of that chain. All those islands north of here are national marine sanctuary. And this is what those look like. You saw that beach. These are plastics being floating up onto islands that are thousands of miles from the nearest human habitation. What James and Kevin are doing is they're taking a ship up that island chain. This is a 30-day voyage. They take 30 days, they take a crew up this island chain to these deserted islands, and they pick up plastics. Pick them up off the beaches, pick them up off the coral reefs, pick them up off the animals. They're bringing home between 40 and 50 tons of plastics every trip. He's now making 2 trips a year, and he's working on a third. And in many ways, they're tip of the iceberg. The kind of plastics you're seeing over these deserted islands are everywhere, middle of the Pacific Ocean. And you can see a lot of this is from the fishing industry. I'm seeing a lot of buoys, I'm seeing fish nets, polymers, things like that, polyesters. But we're also seeing a lot of just household items, the bottles floating up, the milk containers sitting there. There's a picture of the ship that he takes up that island chain every 3 months to collect plastics. So as you can see, plastics is a huge problem just in terms of environmental. Let's get back to our plastics chart. Here we are looking at the resin codes. And I basically want to look at the bottom 2 lines here. Let's talk about recycling plastics and how long it takes to decompose. Number 1, recycling plastics. So the second line from the bottom. You can see optimally what percentage of plastics get recycled. I think these numbers are, the 1, 2s, and 6s there. We're looking at a third of those get recycled. I think that's optimistic. I think that is optimistic. But let's assume that's true. We're getting a third of those recycled. The thing that people don't talk about, the plastics industry, when they say, hey, we can recycle, we're recycling a third. Great. Okay, what they don't talk about is you can recycle virgin plastic once. You melt it down, you reform it, you've got a new product. That product is less pure. There are impurities from the previous product. There are chemicals from the previous product that are still part of the process, and actually heating the plastic and recasting it actually alters those chemicals. So this second generation plastic is lower quality than the virgin plastic and has a higher toxicity rate. So there are less uses for that second generation plastic. In some rare cases, that can be melted and brought into a third generation plastic. But as you can imagine, that third generation plastic is even lower quality. At that point, you're junk plastic. There's very, very few things you can do with that. So even when we're talking about plastic type 1 or 2 or 6, that 1/3 of them can be recycled, bear in mind that it can only be recycled once, maybe twice, and then it still ends up in the landfill. Every plastic made will end up in the landfill within a year, especially the type 1s and type 2s, which are single-use plastics. Even if they're recycled, they will still end up in a landfill someplace in a year, in those mountains of landfills in Chile, in Kenya, washed into the ocean. And then we get to the bottom line here. How long to decompose under perfect conditions? And decompose is kind of a misnomer. Plastics never decompose. They never break down into their constituent components, the carbon, the hydrogen. What plastics do is they break down into smaller pieces. We talked about those long chain polymers, those man-made polymers. There's nothing in nature that can break that down. nature looks in there and goes, I've never seen that before. I don't know how to break that down. So it just sits there. When they talk about decompose in terms of these number of years, 5, 10, 1,000 years, what they're actually talking about is the plastic breaking down into small enough particles that we can no longer see the plastic. So it looks like it's decomposed, but it hasn't. If you get down there with a microscope, you're seeing that those particles are still pure plastic resin. So look at that. Number one, type 1. That's our, our water bottles mostly. 5, 10 years for that to break down. 2 and 5 tends to be pill bottles, laundry detergent, these things, 100 years, 20, 30 years. Look at our low density polyethylene, or 4. That's our shrink wrap, our food wrapping, the plastic films on our food. 500 to 1,000 years for that to break down into particles small enough we can no longer see them. 100 years for type 2. Number 6, good news here, polystyrene. You remember the old clamshells we used to get our fast food in? Don't see those anymore. Those are so bad, those are so toxic in terms of chemical leaching that even the fast food industries quit using them. Can you imagine? So we're really seeing number 6 being phased out. And number 7, they don't recycle at all. Number 7 is the category for everything that's so toxic, we really should stay away from it. These are things that contain BPAs, BPSs, the chemicals that have been outlawed. These are other things that just will not break down. They also dump polylactic acid here, which is bioplastic. You've probably heard of the new bioplastic going to save the world. That will break down in 6 months. But there's a fallacy there. See, bioplastics are made of plants just like normal plastics. Crude oil is fossilized plants from millions of years ago. Bioplastics are made from the sugars in corn. They, extract the corn syrup, for example. We also use beets for bioplastic. They extract the sugars, they break down the carbon and hydrogen and create the same monomers you would get from fossil fuel. And then they just chain them together into these large man-made polymer chains. Those are just as hard to break down as plastic itself. And more importantly, so they can be broken down, which we thought was good. More importantly, biodegradable bioplastics need a high temperature industrial composting facility to break down. So the next time you're in the store, the grocery store, you grab that bag that says compostable, or you're buying a box of bioplastic plates or bioplastic silverware. We see a lot of that. It says compostable, big letters on the front. Turn that around. You're going to see a disclaimer on the box, on the bag, whatever, that says compostable in an industrial facility only. Your area may not have quite a facility, which is true because most areas in the world do not. I've only seen 2 or 3 of these industrial facilities in my travels across the whole country. So the fact is that biodegradable bioplastic you have, yay, it's not going to biodegrade in your compost heap in the backyard. It requires commercial level temperatures over a 6-month period to break down. And most places in the world don't have that facility. So they're going to end up in your landfill, just like any other plastic. And the downside of that is that the bioplastics, when they do break down in that landfill over that 6-month period, they release a lot of methane. The plastic resins, the real plastics we put in there, the resins tend to be intact. So they're going to stay in that landfill forever. These bioplastics that are designed to break down eventually over 6 months at high temperature, which you do get in a landfill, it releases massive amounts of methane. And I think everybody in this room knows that methane is a much more critical greenhouse gas, CO2. So bioplastic hype. Surviving it. And here's where we're going to start talking about the chemicals leaching from the plastics.
There's been a lot of buzz about dubious chemicals in the environment that might contribute to some pretty frightening stuff like obesity, breast cancer, thyroid issues. And they seem to lurk everywhere. In pesticides, cosmetics, and especially plastic packaging. In light of this, it's understandable to start panicking. But before you do, let's hear what molecular biologist Bruce Bloomberg has to say on the subject. He's been studying the link between synthetic chemicals and obesity for around 15 years. So he might be able to give us a better idea of what's really going on and what to do about it. Bad news is, Bloomberg confirmed that, yep, we're surrounded by these chemicals. One of the most well-known is BPA, or bisphenol A, which shows up in water bottles, cans, milk cartons, and more.
You get them from thermal paper receipts. Like I have these receipts from a recent trip. All of these things are coated with bisphenol A. And it goes right into your skin.
BPA has been making headlines for years about whether or not it's harming us. And while FDA-funded and independent studies have conflicting conclusions, the bigger heart of the issue is this: BPA is hard to get away from, because it's a key building block in the tough, clear, flexible plastic called polycarbonate. And that proximity to food is what concerns scientists like Bloomberg.
You don't want to store food in plastics because some fraction of those plastics will leach into your food.
The BPA molecules that make up plastic are bound together by what's called an ester bond, which is extremely sensitive to heat. So when you heat up your food in plastic, that heat breaks some of the bonds, releasing the chemicals into your food. A survey by the CDC of 2,517 people estimated that over 90% of Americans have detectable levels of BPA in their urine. And BPA isn't alone. Phthalates, which make plastic flexible, can also leach into food when heated. And reviews of hundreds of studies have linked BPA and phthalates to heart disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. Not to mention, a 2015 review linked phthalates with impaired neurological development in children, which in 2018 prompted the American Academy of Pediatrics to announce that families should avoid plastic food containers entirely. And other studies on animals like mice and monkeys have shown that these chemicals can lead to problems in the lungs, brains, and reproductive organs. This is about the time someone like me would probably panic. But there are ways you can avoid these chemicals. Bloomberg suggests it's best to just stick to heating your food in anything but plastic. Now, quick aside, BPA-free plastic containers aren't the answer, because research suggests that BPS and BPF, the most common replacements for BPA, might have similar effects on your body. Instead, opt for replacements like ceramic or glass containers.
You have to do the best you can, and it makes sense to me to do the things that give you the most return for the least effort.
It's a good video. Those are good conclusions. So we're talking about all these chemicals that leach into our foods, especially when heated. And that's why we should never microwave plastics. Even the microwavable plastics, which is going to be a resin 2 or 5, a little bit more solid, but as we'll see in a minute, they also contain toxins. So, I would never microwave in plastic. The BPA that they just talked about, plastic hardener, makes our plastic rigid. I've got lots of studies noted in the book, even FDA. And FDA is very, very limited in what it's willing to say against industry. Even the FDA has identified the potential harms, brain behavior, infants, children. A lot of the studies I'm reading suggest links to that increased blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease. And, what do we as Americans suffer the most? Blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease. Plastics are behind that. The plasticizers, which is what makes our plastics flexible, and the ones that can bend and such, again, heart disease, cancers, and endometriosis. These have been banned from toys and children. Again, let's protect the children, but we're also exposing adults to them, so they just should be banned entirely. The alkylphenols is the lubricants. We saw that machine earlier that was extracting the plastic throwaway cups. The lubricants are specifically so the plastic will come off that mold. If we don't put lubricants in the plastic, then it tends to stick to that mold and then the machines get jammed. So there's no reason for the lubricants other than to make the machines run smoothly. And these lubricants are known endocrine disruptors, known to have impacts on our kidneys. And flame retardants. We want the flame retardants. Remember, all plastics are made out of fossil fuel. In the day, your sofa would just spontaneously burst into flames if it got too hot. So even governments have mandated massive levels of flame retardants, BFRs, which have been banned. Now they're looking at CFRs, which is chlorinated flame retardants, which are questionable, and they're now moving into, I think, PFRs, phosphated flame retardants. There's always a new chemical to replace the one that just got banned. Thing about flame retardants, there's been so much legislation demanding more and more flame retardant that something like the hard computer case on your TV, it is actually 30% flame retardant by weight. That's a lot of chemicals in that piece of plastic. And all of these, BFR, CFRs, PFRs, linked to possible breast cancer, endocrine disruptors, reproductive toxicity, adverse effects on fetal and child development, neurological function, neurobehavioral function. I'm seeing studies that are looking at the increase in ADHD, all these various things that we see becoming ubiquitous within our children and at schools. Where's that coming from? Really, the increase in those neurological diseases, autism being one, those match the increase in the use of plastics in our home. And then there's the PFAs, the polyfluoroalkyl substances, waterproofing, flame retardant, again, obviously very important. I mean, who needs plastics that aren't waterproof? The thing about PFAs is that they were originally marketed as Teflon. That's how ubiquitous that product is. The PFAs are the classic forever chemical. Once they enter the environment, once they enter your body, they're going to be there for tens of thousands of years. Any of us that used the original Teflon cookware back in the day, the little skillets with the nonstick, we were just heating up PFAs and putting it directly into our food. Of course, we have high levels of this in our bodies. How could we not? Research is linking these PFAs, high cholesterol, heart disease, blood pressure. Again, what's the most prevalent diseases in our society right now? Blood pressure, heart disease, high cholesterol, cancers, kidney cancer, testicular, all these different cancers. These are all related to plastics, the chemicals in them. Also seeing other links here, different studies in animals, born deaths. There's been so much going on in terms of PFA-related disease and testing and results that DuPont's actually settled this large number of cases over PFA links in the Ohio River. That's $750 million in settlements. And interesting aside here, DuPont actually spun off a separate corporation and started a new company and transferred all rights to all their PFA-related products to this company. Obviously, deliberately to shelter DuPont from lawsuits. Now, this company is the one responsible for all these payouts and stuff. Turned out it was so bad that that company they created actually turned around and sued DuPont for lying to them about the toxicity of the chemical. I find that really ironic. When we talked about glasses a few minutes ago, one thing that surprised me, shocked me, scared me, soft contact lenses are almost pure PFAs. So not only are our non-stick Teflon skillet feeding us PFAs, forever chemicals, every time you put that soft contact in your eye, you're just putting forever chemicals in your eyes. I've had several studies now that find a direct correlation between severe eye disease and high concentrations of PFAs in our bodies. So let's look at this chart again. This time we're looking at toxicity level and chemicals. This is a little blurry. Don't worry about the actual chemical names. Worry about the skull and crossbones. I mean, there's our 7 resin types, resin groups, if you will. You see the 1, the 3, and the 6 and 7. Highly toxic. We should do the best we can to stay away from those. Ironically, 1 is our water bottles. 1 is our most of the food containers that we bring our foods home in. As I mentioned, the styrofoam tends to be going away. We're still seeing some styrofoam packs under our meats and such. We're seeing less of that. But, all the food we're bringing home that has plastic around it, those are the toxic ones, the 1s, some 6s. As I said, you don't want to microwave that. I don't even want to leave my food in it. First thing I do when I bring food home from the store is I immediately take it out of the plastic and put it in glass refrigerator storage. So I've done a really good job of getting all the plastics out of my kitchen. And when that grocery bag comes home, part of my unpacking process is to unwrap everything and put it in glass or metal storage. So the number one's extremely toxic. Our polyester clothing, also number one. We'll come back to that in a moment. The number three, PVC. That's the water pipes, the old PVC water piping in your home. Also used for sewage lines, PVC there, which isn't so much of a hazard. But those chemicals are still leaking and, feeding into the sewage systems and into the water systems. The thing I want to take away from this chart is the 2, the 4, and the 5. These are the less toxic plastics, and these are the plastics that we can reuse. We talk about reduce, refuse, reduce, reuse. I mean, if we already have these plastics, rather than adding them to the landfill stream, we can reuse those. And the 2s, 4s, and 5s are how we want to do that. Hence the IC plastics, identifying those, training ourselves to turn our bottles over and look at the bottom and say, oh, this is a 2. I can use this for future storage. Number 4 is the bread wrappers on your bread loaves. I've actually gotten into the habit of saving the plastic off my bread. And next time I go to the store, I'll take that with me and put whatever loose foods I need into that instead of grabbing that allegedly compostable bag, which really isn't. So there are ways that the 2s, 4s, and 5s can be reused better for the environment and safer for you than using any of the 1s, 3s, or 6s. So it's important to know these numbers and understand them. We spend a good deal of time talking about this. Now let's get into microplastics.
This man is known as the godfather of microplastic research. In fact, Professor Richard Thompson invented the term.
Microplastics are basically just small fragments of plastic that are accumulating in the environment.
His latest research has uncovered something that has sent shock waves around the fashion industry.
The data we've collected show significant increase in the quantities of microplastic in the environment. And a lot of what we found in that study was plastic fibers.
Synthetic materials like polyester, nylon, and acrylic are made of plastic fibers. These degrade and break up in a washing machine cycle.
If we take a domestic washing load, that could release up to 700,000 fibers in a single wash. Now that's going to go to wastewater treatment. Some of those fibers will be intercepted in wastewater treatment, but a good number will potentially escape to the environment. The data suggests that they're accumulating year on year.
Microplastics, microfibers. I mean, what the doctor was saying there, 1,900 synthetic fibers are released from a single garment when it's washed. That's around 700,000 microfibers per average wash in America, all going into our sewage systems. This Ellen MacArthur Foundation study in 2017, they estimated 1.4 quadrillion microfibers in the ocean as a result of watering clothes. 1.4 quadrillion, that's a number followed by 15 zeros. Massive number. It's hard to even conceive what that number looks like. 1.7 million tons of microfibers getting into the ocean each year. The thing about microfibers, and this is where it's affecting our health most dramatically, I mean, obviously bad for the environment, but these microfibers cling together and they create these little, I like to call them bacteria hotels. It's a perfect environment for bacteria and pathogenic funguses to breed. And they're doing this within our sewage systems. So we've got these microfiber hotels in the sewage systems that are protecting bacteria and fungus from the treatment. All the chemicals being dumped into that sewage processing pond, these little microfiber hotels are protecting their residents. So the residents get exposed to these chemicals, but they survive. And because they're exposed and survive, they're developing tolerance. And then they get released into their rivers out in the ocean. And this is where most of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria and these anti-treatable fungals are entering our environment. So not only is plastic directly bad for us, but they're creating an environment that's more toxic for us in terms of the bacteria and fungus that we're exposed to. Well, what about risk of accidental exposure? We've been talking about eating plastics, breathing plastics, all of these things. What about accidental exposure? Express, name of a ship, sank in 21 in the Indian Ocean off of Sri Lanka. Largest plastic spill in history. it dumped 87 containers of nurdles into the Indian Ocean. The chemicals leaching from these nurdles killed all the fish and then worked its way up the food chain. Massive kill-offs of sea turtles, dolphins, whales. And more directly impacting us, there were 20,000 families in the area that depended on fishing for their food source, for their livelihood. And all of those were displaced because this section of the ocean died. It's from a single spill. Some of us will remember a couple of years ago, 23, the Ohio train derailment, Palestine, Ohio. Well, the containers that derailed and broke and spilled, they contained vinyl chloride, part of PVC, which causes drowsiness, numbness, known carcinogen. Another container contained butyl acrylate, again, used to produce various polymers, coatings, resins, irritation, skin rashes, causes difficulty breathing. So butylene, packaging materials used for that, dizziness and headaches. Ethyl hexyl acrylate used in plastics and polymers, skin, eyes, throat, nausea, irritation. All these chemicals were released by this train derailment. I actually had a chance to work with and interview a resident of Palestine, I think early last year, a webinar we did. And he talked about this. And the fact is, he hasn't been able to work since. He's unemployable. He has health issues. I mean, his life is obviously going to be cut short. He's still functioning, but he is unable to spend more than a few hours out of bed at any time. He talked about this spill. He wasn't actually adjacent to it. He was several miles away. He talked about this spill and the fact that this was shutting down a major train transport line. And rather than coming in and doing a cleanup, removing all these toxins from the earth, to speed the process, they decided to just burn it. So they set the whole thing on fire. And what that did was basically vaporized all these chemicals and sent these massive plumes, these chemical clouds into the air that actually affected people for miles away. And that's why his life has been destroyed, because of the plastic products that are entering our environment accidentally and on purpose. So that's a lot of stuff. When I was writing this book, I actually stopped halfway through. I'm going, oh my God, I don't know that I can continue with it. There are so many problems associated with this, and this is so ubiquitous that there's nothing we can do. Well, there's a lot of things we can do. And let's talk about living without it, ways that we can remove the plastics from our environment. And I've worked on this for the last 2 years, and I've gotten 80% of the plastics out of my home. My kitchen is now plastic free. It's obviously still got plastic appliances, the type 5s, which is a hard, low toxicity plastic. So it still has that. But I've worked really hard to get rid of all the plastic food storage, immediately get rid of all the plastic wrappers I bring home. And I've really modified my shopping habits so I don't bring plastic home. Look at this chart. The most plastics, where's plastic being most used? Where does it enter our environment? Mostly in packaging. Look at that, 146 million metric tons. In our textiles, clothing we wear, and the consumer and industrial products, those 3 light blue areas, those are all things we have direct control over. We can control what the clothing is we wear. We can control what we buy and therefore how it's packaged. And we can control the consumer products, the food storage containers, all of those various things in our home. So we can have a big impact on the plastics in our immediate environment. So we can eliminate the single-use plastics. Going to the store, obviously shop with cloth bags, not the Walmart plastic bag that they give you, but legitimate cloth bags. Buying food in glass metal containers. One of the things we had a lot of fun with in the workbook is what we call the shopping challenge. We set up this contest, gamified this, and created this scenario that lets you compete in the grocery store, lets you go in and try to buy less plastic. And we've mapped out a path through the traditional grocery store that lets you fill your buggy up with metal and glass contained food first and natural produce. You go into a grocery store, they're designed to sell you things. The first things you encounter are not the best things for you. They're the things that they make the most profit on, usually have the most plastics. You really got to start at the back of the store. There is a pathway through the traditional stores that let you fill your buggy up with non-plasticized foods. And then what's remaining that you do need, the plastics go on top. And then we have a system for scoring that. So you actually leave the store with my score. And your goal is to have a better score next time, or to shop with friends, neighbors, whatever, and compare your scores. So we're creating a community group dynamic that helps you lessen your addiction on single-use plastics, buying more things in glass and food containers. And in home too. I mean, replacing all your plastics at home with glass and metal storage by bulk. Instead of that container, that plastic bag of dried beans, if you like beans, there are many stores that have those in bulk containers. You can take that bag off the loaf of bread that's pretty stable, that type 4, wasn't it? Take it back in there and, get your bulk beans and do it that way. Take them home, put it in a glass container. So all of those will help you eliminate single-use plastics from your home. And then we can also eliminate plastic clothing. By plastic clothing, we mean polyester, acrylic, nylon, spandex, lycra. Really, you read the tag, read the label. If you don't recognize what that is, I'll guarantee you it's a man-made fossil fuel petrotextile. The only natural fibers you're going to find in clothing is linen, hemp, cotton, wool. Look for those. Get the plastics off your body. A study in the book, and this was like 8 years ago, the airline industry rolled out new polyester uniforms across the industry. And suddenly there was this huge surge of illnesses among flight crew. We're talking about flight crew that actually coming off the plane, being taken to the emergency room. We're actually talking about people that died from allergic reactions to these uniforms. The airline unions eventually took these uniforms and tested them. And type 1 plastics, arsenic, butyls, the number of toxins in these clothes was amazing. Shocking, I should say. It was shocking. The thing I remember, I think this was Yale doing this study. I think the thing I remember from one of the scientists, she said that the airline industry is the canary in the coal mine. It's not that their clothes had more toxins in them, it's that they were wearing them more. The airline industry puts on their uniform and they wear it for 10, 12-hour stretches, these long flights. We're all wearing clothes with the same toxic chemicals in them. We just don't wear them as often as the airline did. And the people in the airline were ending up in emergency rooms or dying. We have to stop and think what those polyesters are doing to us on a slower incremental basis. So it's so easy to eliminate the plastics from your home. And if you do need a plastic, if you need a spandex, something to work out with, a jogger, an acrylic jacket, buy that vintage, buy that secondhand. 2 advantages there. You're not entering a new plastic into the environment, and you're getting something that's been out there for a while, so some of the chemicals will have already been leached out. So if you need to have plastics, go to the secondhand store, go to the Goodwill, buy what you need. Otherwise, just eliminate plastics. Refuse, reduce, reuse. That's our mantra. Refuse to buy new plastics, reduce the plastics you need, and reuse those few decent plastics that you can reuse. I think I just said all of those right there. So I think that wraps that up. I mean, there's a lot of depressing news here. Like I said, this study was very difficult for me to do. There's points when I just had to stop writing because it is pretty serious looking. But you look at this page here, and there's so many things we can do. And I'm standing here saying after 2 years, really, I've got most of the real toxicity out of my home and off my body and out of my food systems. So it can be done, and I encourage you to take action to do this.